Hey, it's Mike here, and today a recent 2025 study looked at past trauma and the likelihood of going on a plant-based diet. And it did find, looking at various types of trauma, that it was more likely for traumatized people to go on a plant-based diet. Yep, vegans are just a bunch of traumatized people going around trying to force people to be vegan and traumatize with them. I'm kidding. But the research won't stop at this study because we can actually frame this in terms of some other recent, say 2021 to 2023 studies that look a bit at this, just not in as much detail to give us a fuller picture. And we just have to ask the question, why is this the case? Which we have to look at even more research to figure out. And I wasn't even gonna do a whole video on this study, but on my recent Costa Rica trip, we just started talking about this study and people were really fascinated by it. So I'm like, maybe I should cover this. And yeah, I have more trips in the works, so you can click below to get on the trip list. But I also want to say, because this is a video about trauma, here is something to lighten it up a little bit. Footage I just got a couple days ago of a sloth scratching itself. Isn't it just so cute? I want to start by saying I've been super fascinated about trauma, not just because it's a major factor dictating people's behavior interpersonally, but also in terms of like global and historical events, but also just that the trauma experts have seemed to have made a lot of headway in the last 5 or 10 or so years when we have major people like Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine, who have talked about how trauma is stored in the body, which is something that we didn't really look at before.
The problem with trauma is that when it's over, your body continues to relive it.
One great example of this is Peter Levine's story working with a war veteran, talking about how he has these tics that traced back to certain muscles, showed that they were the result of him like jumping out of a caravan at war when like everybody else was killed, and that was the muscle that he rolled out with, and they could sort of trace it back and get rid of his tics that way, which to me is you know, sounds pretty spectacular.
See, the movements that you're making are the kind of movements that your body would have made if there was an explosion. You know? And what it's doing is it's kind of repeating those movements over and over again.
And that's what the body does in trauma. It replays the trauma over and over as somatic signs and symptoms. That's really, really important.
And psychiatrist Dr. Tracy Marks here on YouTube also covers it really well.
Trauma is a complex psychological and physiological response to experiences that overwhelm a person's capacity to cope.
Dr. Gabor Mate also has some amazing insights on trauma. You know, here he is for a second.
So what I'm saying about trauma is that trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you.
But with this growing idea that trauma is stored in the body, it's no surprise that somebody who is traumatized to whatever degree might have a little bit more thought around what they put into their body. And that, of course, brings me to the main study at hand. So let's just get to it and then start theorizing. And that is this study, again, 2025, and it looked at a nationally representative US sample of 1,600 people, 250 of which were plant-based, which I do have to say in this case, were either vegan or vegetarian people. So once again, they're lumping them together, but still similar insights here. They then went ahead and gave them the International Trauma Exposure Measure questionnaire, also known as ITEM. So Doc, you're saying that we're an item? No, that's just the name of the trauma questionnaire. It would ask things like, were you assaulted as a child, on and on and on. And I will say it's unfortunately did not delineate between people that may have ethically gone vegetarian or vegan versus for health reasons. And there are some interesting dynamics going on there, which we'll cover later. You know, what motivations for those different groups could there be with regard to trauma? But we can just get to the results specifically. And the most general main finding was just that people who had some type of past general trauma were about 10% more likely to eat a plant-based diet. So no, this doesn't mean that everybody went vegan as a result of trauma, but you know, it's very possible that a lot of people did. And I'll even talk about my own story later on. They also did a questionnaire for interpersonal relationship violence. So we're talking about like domestic abuse, stuff like that. And the results were even more dramatic, with people experiencing that type of trauma having a 2.3 times likelihood of going on a plant-based diet than those who didn't. So next time someone says, I'm vegan, you can simply respond with, who hurt you? The researchers say, quote, "These results suggest the importance of considering the role of trauma and victimization when examining links between plant-based diet and other outcomes." And just really quickly, in terms of conflicts of interest, you might notice by how there is no seemingly well-designed chain of releasing this into the media and smearing vegan diets. And that's probably because it wasn't designed from the ground up to do that, like many other studies have been. And it was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, so pretty clear funding with no conflicts of interest. So let's talk about the why of this. And obviously we don't have a perfect answer here, but we can sort of examine it. And we again have that people going vegetarian and vegan for ethical reasons, and then people deciding to eat these types of diets for just some type of health reason, etc., even environmental, which is again not delineated. And the researchers come right out and say, quote, "Theoretically, plant-based diets may be more common among trauma exposed because those with trauma may have increased empathy." So it's pretty obvious. Somebody who has undergone great suffering in the past might see that happening to animals and be like, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I don't want to inflict that. I don't want to pay for people to do that. I'm just going to give it up. But that sounds kind of like an assumption. Is that even true that people who have experienced trauma have increased empathy? Well, yes, at least from this study looking at childhood trauma. Quote, "Adults who reported experiencing a traumatic event in childhood had elevated empathy levels compared to adults who did not experience a traumatic event. Further, the severity of trauma correlated positively with various components of empathy." Total side tangent, but I just mentally connected this. I was once on tour with a band in California, and we accidentally got booked at a metal bar, and we were kind of scared that all the metal people were going to be really mean, but they were the nicest people of anybody on the tour. So, maybe whatever trauma they had led them to get into metal music, but then also have a lot of empathy. Totally random side tangent. And of course, also more extremely, certain traumatic events could definitely sensitize people to blood and gore. Another reason they don't want to be hurting animals. Anyway, then there's the sort of health aspect here, as the researchers also say, quote, "While traumatic experiences may create or exacerbate psychopathy, those consuming plant-based diets may desire to cope by eating more healthily." And this is where my personal story comes in, and I sort of hesitate to call it trauma because I don't even remember it. It was sort of just a family story. But again, as I mentioned in my Alzheimer's video, I had my grandma, who was typically like a nonviolent person. As she got worse and worse with Alzheimer's living in our house, fighting with me, she decided to, basically try to murder me with a hammer. And thankfully my mom stopped it. But that was one of the reasons that I recently just recounted my vegan story on that Costa Rica trip. We had a nice little vegan therapy session. As I specifically said, being handed the China study and having that section about Alzheimer's and heart disease and heart health and artery health, making me think, oh wow, I want to have a lower chance of getting Alzheimer's in the future, so nothing like that ever happens again. That's like a very clear, traumatic event line drawn directly to a decision to go on a plant-based diet. And then later I was like, oh, yay, animals. I can care about them now that I'm no longer hurting them directly. And we also have another interesting angle here, sort of along the health lines, and that is people who have trauma deciding to go on a plant-based diet, at least partially as a coping mechanism for even their mental health. And while we have some interesting studies on this that actually somewhat support it, it is also sort of a dangerous thing in the sense that people trying to change their diet to heal some type of trauma that may not be possibly healed through a vegan diet, plant-based diet, whatever, can of course lead to what I've seen happen over and over again, where people end up going ex-vegan because this issue wasn't solved, it seems, and a lot of times you can have trauma-related gastrointestinal issues, and people, go on a vegan diet, and then maybe they're able to slightly arrest it, but then because they never fixed the root issue of that trauma, they're just gonna keep having these same issues over and over again.
Your body keeps mobilizing itself to fight. You have all kind of immunological abnormalities, endocrine abnormalities, and that really devastates your physical health also. Oftentimes the physical problems are longer lasting than the mental problems.
And that's my theory looking at some ex-vegans, and I've mentioned that really briefly in maybe 1 or 2 of my 500 videos, who knows even where. But yeah, so it's good to seek professional mental health help, and not just rely on a dietary change. That being said, as the researchers even mentioned, quote, "Emerging literature concerning plant-based diets and trauma has shown that plant-based diets can help promote resilience in the domains of improved physical and mental well-being by mitigating the negative physical or mental impact of trauma." So there may be some role, and they do cite a small pilot study on war veterans who were put on a plant-based diet. And you can see from these charts, we really see a trend of lower PTSD symptoms and then quite a trend of lower depression symptoms. But that's a small study. It needs to be repeated. However, we again do have at least this Australian study showing that vegans had lower levels of depressive symptom scores, while the meat eaters had higher, actually averaging at mildly depressed. And that brings me to another larger study on over 9,000 Adventists. And this one's a bit complicated. They sort of triangulated plant-based diet and childhood traumatic events and mortality, and the results were, quote, plant-based diet intake was associated with a reduction in the association of 4 or more adverse childhood experiences with early mortality, talking about 27% lower mortality when adjusted for a bunch of stuff. And they also estimate that after 4+ adverse childhood experiences, those eating high versus low plant-based dietary intake may live 5.4 years longer. That is wild. I can't explain exactly what's going on here. Is there some type of maybe reverse causation where people who are coping with their things properly also happen to be choosing a healthier diet and they're just coping better instead of just going to cigarettes and booze or something? I don't know. Or it's just something else, maybe something in the food, which brings me to the third study here, also on the Adventist population, which looked at dietary flavonoids, or really antioxidants, as potentially doing the job. They say, quote, a varied diet rich in flavonoids may reduce depressive symptoms associated with perceived stress following adverse childhood experiences, exposure. That's hard to say. And then real quick, there are other areas that do support this whole idea of people going vegan due to trauma. We've seen direct stories of this in the area of people whose families were connected to wars. We also have women saying this, and we have, black people, etc. The first example here is Alex Hershaft, who was like a Holocaust survivor, talking about working, basically auditing a slaughterhouse and being like, crap, this looks really familiar. I'm going to go vegan. It's literally his whole story, literally trauma leading directly to going vegan. And then we also have the inequality of women, which has been explored in the sexual politics of meat with, quote, when women who have been abused recognize the shared fate of animals in a patriarchal world, they often see vegetarianism or veganism as a way to reject the violence they have suffered and to refuse to participate in the oppression of others. Yeah, so some women might obviously associate just animal exploitation and that system with the same system that might be oppressing them, especially when seeing the dairy industry and what's happening with mothers, etc., might decide to go vegan. I'm sure women can explain it a lot better than me anyway. And then, of course, we have racial issues, and obviously human slavery has very many parallels to the current animal exploitation system that we have today. And so that's one aspect of it, and I've seen people talk about that as black vegans, but then I've also seen, especially from this BBC article, a desire to go plant-based for health reasons as a way to sort of reclaim some agency there as well. And then finally, I wanted to say that this whole issue might be where eating disorders can connect to veganism, especially a plant-based diet eating, more pure plant-based diet eating like raw diets, etc., as well, as I've seen happen, at least anecdotally. And that is that, PTSD can be associated with perfectionism, as this study mentions. And so people who already have eating disorders might try to use veganism as a way to mask their eating disorder. I've talked about this in the past. However, there are studies that do show that vegans have lower levels of eating disorder scores. For example, even this one on sort of like body shape scores particularly being lower and overall scores being lower. So, that's not necessarily supported from all data, but I've personally just seen like anorexic people go vegan and then just deny anorexia. And it's really hard to watch, but it happens. And there's also this interesting aspect of animal activism also being as a result of trauma. I've definitely met some animal activists who've had like crazy life stories, and that is supported by this study where they say, quote, the narrative illustrated suggested that trauma was a key driver of activism. The participants worked through their traumas through activism, and in doing so, they used verbal and nonverbal, personal and communal, conscious and unconscious processes. And as a result, use activism as a way to sort of transform trauma, which, might be a healthier way to do it. It might also just result in you screaming at people and throwing red paint at them for wearing fur. It's fun times. We're all complex humans. Anyway, in the end, I think we need more data. This study was pretty good, but it would have been cool to see more vegan-specific stuff as opposed to just vegetarian. However, a lot of people literally go vegetarian so that animals don't die in their mind, although the dairy industry literally is the meat industry. That can just be a lack of education sometimes. But yeah, it's pretty clear that in some cases, trauma is probably leading to people being vegan. It appears to have played some role in my transition to a plant-based diet. Obviously, it has for people like Alex Hershaft and his, World War II family history. Those people with the relationship violence, especially, which, I can't speak to. However, it likely seems to be some connection between being fully victimized and just seeing other victims maybe and being like, absolutely not. No, I'm not going to be involved in that. But I'm glad I made this video because, again, back to Dr. Gabor Mate, one of the things that he mentions is that a lot of our trauma problems are because trauma isn't fun to talk about, and then as a society and as cultures, we ignore it, and then we don't learn how to deal with it, and then it creates more problems and more trauma and is sort of self-perpetuating. So yeah, it's good to talk about this stuff. And so yeah, if you are a vegan or on a plant-based diet to some extent, I'm curious to know if you have just made a connection of like, oh crap, I can directly connect this traumatic part of my life or whatever to my decision to change my diet and lifestyle. Like, let us know down below if you do want to share that, or you can just like message me. And as usual, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Click my trip list if you're interested in that, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Is there anything else I say?